Welcome to Burner Tutorials. In this session, we're going to be looking at Reactor basics. First, we're going to look at what is Reactor, and then we're going to look at how does it work, generally speaking. So let's jump in. So first, we're going to look at a simple example of what Reactor can do. Now, this is possibly the simplest example. So here we have a square on the ground. Now that isn't needed. This is purely just so I know where to walk. And above that is a collider. So an invisible box area that as soon as I touch it, it will create an event. That event will tell an animated object to change animation. And that's where the magic of Reactor basically is. Most of the magic of Reactor is in the animator of an object. So an animator can have a bunch of different animations, can be quite simple or quite complicated, that Reactor can trigger. So you have complete control over what an asset's animation does. So at the moment, the sphere, for example, is running an idle animation. So just this very subtle up and down. And as soon as I walk into here, it will play a single loop event of a simple jump. And then it will return back to idle. And once again, if I walk out and then go back in, it'll jump again. So what I'm basically doing is entering this collider, and that collider is telling the animator on the sphere to change animations by changing a parameter on the animator. So here we have our asset. Once again, the box on the ground is purely visual, so I could actually delete that if I wanted to. This collider is the main thing, but I'm going to leave it there so I know where the collider is. There are two main elements to a reactor. There is the target object, which has the animator here. And then you have the reactor object, which has the reactor script and the collider. Now, these two components could be on the sphere down here, for example, but that gets a lot more complicated. So I like to organize my reactors by having a empty game object here with these two assets, and then the animator on the asset. At the moment, Reactor has two types of events. So in the example I've given, when I walk into it, or as soon as I enter the trigger, I will set the sphere animator object. So this parameter, which we'll get to in a second, which is a trigger, and just make that happen. There are lots of tools you can use, so you can add a number, subtract a number, multiply or divide a number, or invert the parameter. Invert would go from sort of true to false if it is a boolean, or go 1 to -1 or -1 to 1 if it is a int. So we have our parameter, which we need to name down here, and the value type. So we have ints or whole numbers, we have floats or decimal numbers, boolean, which is a true or false, and trigger, which is just like do this and then return to its default state. Values are for other values, so ints and floats. We also have the ability to have a local reactor event, which means that only one person's computer or the person who triggers it will have that effect. So there are some interesting cases where you'll have the ability to control just one person's rather than everybody's event. The other option is on exit. So as soon as I leave this collider, I can do a similar event. Now I can, if I wanted to, have as many as I wanted to create very complex reactor events. The other thing that a reactor needs is a box collider. So this box collider, or mesh collider, or sphere collider, any collider I believe is supported. You need to create this where you want it so that the character walks into that environment. So it could be as big or as small as you want, but that is the thing that triggers the event. Now in this case, you don't need to put isTrigger to true. However, things like warp volumes and PPV or player property volumes, you do have to put that on. So there's a bit of a difference between that. Let's have a look at our sphere animator. So this is the thing we're actually controlling with Reactor. So this is where the magic happens. So when I enter this collider, trigger something in this animator. So if we click on this asset, we have our two animation types, which you can use with a button that's usually here, so create, or I could create a new clip here if I wanted to. And then on the same asset, we have our animations, so sphere idle and sphere jump. And these arrows are the things that sort of control where the reactor goes. So from sphere idle, which is the default state, I want to transition to jump here. And this is where this goes. So we have a condition, which is on our parameters. So if you start Animator, you'll be on layers. So you go to parameters, and you can add your parameters here if you wanted to. So I could go int state. And I could name it whatever I want. But if I wanted to, I could say state. If the state is greater than 1, do this, basically. If the state is less than or equal to or not equal to 1, do this. But in this case, I have a trigger because I just want it to jump, and then it'll transfer to this. You can see that transition sort of in this process as well. So the idle and then jump. Now, in this case, I just jump once and then automatically return to sphere idle. So you'll notice that this one has no exit time because I want to trigger this event at any time. So as soon as I walk into this collider, jump. But after you've jumped, has exit time. So at the end of the jump, has exit time, transition to the sphere idle again. This does not need a condition, it just needs to automatically do it. You have complete control over if the animation will trigger when you want it to, if it will return by automatically when these animations happen. Now, the power of this comes into the fact that you can nearly animate anything in Unity. So I could, of course, animate a move, I can animate a rotation, I can animate a scale, but it is actually possible to animate all of, or many of the materials on an asset. So I could change the color, I could change the metallic and smoothness, I could change the normal map level and the tiling, which means animation if you use offset. You could turn the volume up or down on something. You could turn sound on or off. You could turn collider on and off. The limits of what Reactor can do are purely on what you can animate and then transition to the different states. And you can animate nearly anything in Unity. So just quickly, if you go to animate and go put the red on, so whatever you do will record, I can animate the sphere collider if it is on or off. I can animate metallic. All of these things, I can change the light color on the emissive if I wanted to. So anything that goes red is basically animatable. And if you have different animations, you can transition between those very easily. The order of creating them is kind of up to you. So you could create the Reactor asset or the animator, but all of them sort of connect to each other. So keep that in mind. There are a few steps that you can miss things on. So one of the common ones is that I will copy the wrong asset in here. So it is looking for a jump on the animator of the cube visual, and the cube visual does not have any animator. So naming and making sure you track all your assets is quite important for this process. So I'm going to put that back in there. The parameter also, if this was a lowercase j, this would not work because it's looking for jump with a lowercase when in my animator it is uppercase. So that would be another issue where the animation does not work. This one up here does not matter. This changes the name up here. So if I have 5 different things, I'd just name it for my own personal understanding of the situation. So let's look at, let's say we use int. So let's add 1 every time I enter it. So that is the examples of a situation where every time that I enter the cube or enter the collider, it will add 1 to the state parameter. So walk in once, 1, walk in twice, 2, etc., etc. And then on top of that, you could create greater than or less than, equals to or not equal to with the animator parameter checks. So if you are creative enough, you could get extremely powerful results with Reactor. So hopefully that helps describe what you can do with Reactor. The next tutorial will be Reactor Doors and another example with Reactor Elevators. And of course, in Mona, you already have really interesting examples of what you can do with Reactor. So hopefully that helps, and happy building.